Hi guys. Now today we're moving on to our fourth and final poem, which is the second poem by Elizabeth Bishop, and it is entitled The Prodigal. Okay, so in this particular poem, she's focusing on her own depression, anxiety, and alcoholism. Now, when we read the title The Prodigal, we're supposed to be reminded of the biblical story. Specifically, we call it a parable because it teaches a moral lesson, has a very specific message essentially to it. And it is the parable or the story of the prodigal son. Now, some people believe, of course, that prodigal means someone who essentially leaves and then comes back looking for forgiveness. But the word prodigal just literally means wasteful, that you spend a lot of money or you indulge yourself. So it's the idea of him being reckless and extravagant. So essentially, the prodigal son then was the younger son of a man who owned quite a lot of land. So he had two sons. The older son then worked the land and was very loyal, very dutiful. The younger son then decided that he wanted his inheritance. He wanted it straight away so he could have a good time. So his father gave him the money that he was due then, obviously, when his father died. So he got that in advance. He went off then and spent the money. So the idea then that he was kind of frittering away all of the money, his inheritance. And then essentially, after he had spent the money, he had wasted the money, he came home looking for forgiveness, and his father actually forgave him. So it's really a poem about forgiveness, about welcoming essentially someone who has done something wrong or foolish and actually forgiving them. So think about it. Of course, a lot of people would identify with the older brother who stayed at home and worked hard. And he complained to his father, why? Why are you welcoming him back with open arms? I've been the good son, essentially. And the father just explained, of course, well, essentially you do have to forgive people when they behave like that. Essentially, he's learned his lesson and he's come home and he's looking for forgiveness. So, if we think about the circumstances of Elizabeth Bishop's life at that particular time, she's writing this poem in the late 1940s, and the poem was published in the New Yorker in the 1950s, so in 1951. She's talking about her own alcoholism and how she had to face up to that, how she had to accept it, and then how she had to try and deal with it herself and overcome all of her, we'd say, emotions and then all of her hardships and challenges. Okay, so that's why she's using the biblical allusion here. It's kind of the idea where she had to realize, of course, that the alcoholism was damaging her and would eventually kill her. She had to sort of mend her ways and come to terms with why she was drinking so much. And essentially, she had to try and stop drinking so much if she wanted to heal, both physically and, of course, emotionally and perhaps psychologically, you could say as well. So she's using the image then of this particular prodigal son in the Bible to represent herself and her own experiences. So the poem, if you think about the story of the poem, becomes a kind of allegory then. It comes to represent Bishop and her own life while telling, of course, the story of the prodigal son. So in the biblical parable, the prodigal son had spent so much money that he was essentially penniless, that he ended up becoming a swineherd. A swineherd, if you think about it, a little bit like a shepherd, but you're looking after swine, you're looking after pigs. So he ended up living with the pigs. That's how destitute and poor he was. And this is where we find the figure of the prodigal son in the poem then. And we're supposed to notice the parallels between his life and then Bishop's life. So she describes at the very beginning then, of course, what the pigsty actually looked and smelt like. So we have very strong visual images here. We also have strong aural images, okay? And we have strong olfactory images. Remember, an olfactory image is an image that appeals to your sense of smell. Okay, so we could read the line, close our eyes, and just imagine, of course, what that particular pigsty smelt like. And if you've ever smelt pig's excrement or slurry, which is like a watered down version, you will know that it smells a little bit like sort of rotten eggs. It has that kind of ammonia smell. It's absolutely disgusting. So she's trying to recreate that in the poem and kind of emphasizing how far he has fallen, The idea was, of course, that he had plenty of money at the beginning of the story because his father gave him his inheritance in advance, and now he has nothing. He's forced, of course, to live with the pigs. He doesn't even have a home of his own. So this is kind of emphasizing the idea then of alcoholism, how it can harm and damage a person, but a person can end up losing everything, losing a family, losing friends, losing a home, losing a career, essentially. It's really how alcoholism can kind of dehumanize you, debase you, essentially, how it can humiliate you. And in the poem, or throughout the poem, she focuses on how ashamed and embarrassed she feels because she now, of course, is this kind of person, essentially, who focuses just on drinking and nothing else. So at the very beginning of the poem then, she describes the pigsty. The brown, enormous odour he lived by was too close. So think of too close, it's kind of suffocating almost. It's overwhelming. But it's kind of suggesting, of course, that the more that he lives there, the longer that he lives there in the pigsty, the less that he notices, of course, this particular stench or stink of the pig's excrement or slurry. So think of brown, of course, obviously a strong visual, and that would emphasize, of course, the brown colour itself. But enormous would suggest overwhelming, that it was a horrible, sort of putrid, pungent stench. So he lived by, of course, because he's right in the middle of the pigs. He literally sleeps in the pigsty, with its breathing and thick hair for him to judge. So it's kind of the idea where he doesn't have a perspective. He can't kind of stand outside of himself and say to himself, what are you doing? Why are you living like this? Okay, so it's the idea then, of course, that he has lost his sense of perspective. He doesn't know anymore, of course, what's right and what's wrong, what's acceptable and what's unacceptable. And this is the idea, of course, that he has been degraded by living in this pigsty. He's become almost like an animal himself. So if you think of breathing and thick hair, think of the very claustrophobic, kind of suffocating image here. If you were lying on the ground surrounded by pigs at night, think of the heavy breathing or the snoring that you would feel, of course, and then think of the thick hair of the pig skin as well. The floor was rotten, so think about it, of course. Think of the image of decay here. Okay, it's not a proper habitat or home for a human being. The floor was rotten, the sty was plastered halfway up, so halfway up the wall essentially of the pigsty, like we'd say waist high. Plastered then with glass smooth dung. And the dung, of course, obviously then is the dirt or the excrement, the slurry itself. So the entire wall then is coated or smeared with the pig excrement or dung, as mentioned here. Think of glass smooth. It's kind of glossy and wet. It would suggest fresh pig slurry here as well. Light-lashed, self-righteous, above moving snouts, the pig's eyes followed him. So think about it, this particular image, like they're almost like his companions or friends now. So you get the idea where he's identifying with the pigs because he's almost become like a creature himself. And yet they still seem sort of odd or strange or kind of alien creatures because obviously they're pigs and he's a human. So think of light lash, think of the pale lashes that you will see obviously on a pig's face. Self-righteous. This might suggest, of course, that, think about it, he feels almost inferior to the pigs, inferior to the animals here. If you're self-righteous, you think that you're always right. It's kind of arrogant and haughty and proud, essentially then. So in a way then, he feels even less than the pigs, inferior to them. Above moving snouts, then you get the idea of the pigs kind of foraging around, of course, for food here. The pig's eyes followed him, a cheerful stare. I think the cheerful stare, it's almost a contradiction, like an oxymoron. How can you stare at someone but still be cheerful? Stare would suggest that you're kind of intimidating the other person, almost a glare essentially. Cheerful would suggest upbeat. So she's trying to suggest both attitudes here, that at times he feels at ease with the pigs, and then at other times, of course, he feels as if they are just kind of these odd creatures and he has nothing in common with them. Even to the sow that always ate her young. And if you think about it, he's emphasizing here, of course, the essential strangeness or oddness then because some pigs, of course, will eat human flesh, and some pigs, of course, I think the sow, the mother pig, will actually eat her own piglets, will eat her own children, her own young, as mentioned here. So it's kind of suggesting, obviously, of course, how vicious they can be, that they're like beasts, essentially. So he's kind of emphasizing how different they are to human beings then. So it's emphasizing the idea, of course, that you can see sort of some positive ideas or features associated with the pigs, and then you can see some very negative ones as well. So till sickening, he leaned to scratch her head. And that's a very sort of affectionate move then, or gesture on his part. But if you think about it, sickening, of course, would suggest once more the idea that he's kind of disgusted by his surroundings and these strange creatures. Sickening, of course, the more we read into the poem, the more we realise, of course, that he's been drinking to excess, that he's hungover. And essentially, of course, he feels ill. He feels kind of queasy or nauseous then. He's sick to his stomach because he's been drinking too much. And if you think about it, it's a kind of catch-22 situation here, of course. He drinks to forget the situation in which he finds himself. But then the more that he drinks, of course, essentially, the less likely he is to get out of that particular situation. So he feels like he's just getting further and further and further into this particular lifestyle, that there's no way that he can climb out of it. There's no way, of course, that he can do anything to help himself. So it reinforces then, of course, Elizabeth Bishop, who's trying to help herself, but perhaps realizing that she needs others to help her. She needs to make the decision, of course, to get out of this with some help. So sometimes mornings after drinking bouts, he hid the pints behind a 2x4. Notice, of course, the little parenthesis, the little brackets there. It's almost like a little conversation, of course, that the poet is having with us. So if we think about 2x4, just simply refers to the panels of wood. It's usually kind of 2 inches by 4, essentially. So think of the idea that he feels ashamed, of course, of what he's doing, that he's hiding the bottles, essentially, as mentioned here, the pints, behind the wooden panel. So nobody knows that he is a secret drinker. And this relates back, of course, obviously to quite a lot of alcoholics as well, who would hide the fact that they're drinking. Because think about it, serious alcoholics, of course, would drink from morning until evening. They wouldn't just wait until the evening and then have a few drinks or a few bottles. They would drink all day. And it's usually that kind of cliche, but it's true, that they would hide the bottles around the house. You know, the idea maybe they'd put them in the cupboard, under the sink, the press under the sink, or maybe they'd put them in the wardrobe, or maybe under the bed, or even in the cistern, you know, kind of behind the toilet as well, or hide it in the shower maybe where nobody would find it. So it's kind of emphasizing the reality then and the degradation of the alcoholic, the secret drinker, essentially, who's ashamed and embarrassed then to admit it to anyone, or to admit it in public as such, to be open about it. So the drinking bouts, of course, if you think about it, in Ireland, we usually use the word sessions. Drinking bouts might suggest kind of binge drinking then, of course, drinking a lot over a couple of hours and then feeling sick, of course, and perhaps even throwing up then as a result of that. So we see a very positive image here. This is sort of the idea, it's emphasizing that the prodigal son here, the heavy drinker, the alcoholic, is still very much human. Okay, he's kind of been brought low to the status or the rank of an animal, but he is not an animal. He's not a beast or a creature. He's very much human. So the sunrise glazed the barnyard mud with red. So it's kind of the idea that at dawn then, of course, you get this brilliant orange or red sunrise. And it's very beautiful, or it's very picturesque, or very, very pretty. And it's kind of the idea that it illuminates the whole barnyard. When he looks out of the pigsty then, he sees the rich colours, the variety of colours, the beauty of nature and the morning sky itself. Think of glazed, of course, it gives that lovely shiny look, that glossy and new look. And think about how dawn here, or the sunrise, can be symbolic. It emphasises the idea of a new day. It emphasises the notion, of course, of another chance, perhaps, an opportunity to mend your ways, to improve yourself. But remember, of course, the idea of a dawn could represent the notion of understanding and a realization as well. You know, that old phrase, that idiom, it dawned on me. And it relates back to the notion of an epiphany as well, a kind of awakening where you realize something important. And that's going to be significant towards the end of the poem as well. So the sunrise glazed the barnyard mud with red. So it's no longer, of course, that dull brown colour. It's almost like it's come to life. It's very vivid, very colourful. The burning puddles seem to reassure. So the pools of water, the kind of puddles of muddy water, of course, think about they're burning because they reflect the sun in the sky, obviously, when it comes to dawn or sunrise itself. So it's almost like they become this rich red and golden or burnt orange colour. They become beautiful, transformed as such then from these rather ordinary kind of dirty puddles of water. So that seemed to reassure him, to kind of comfort him or to calm him as such. So it's the idea when he wakes up then, after the night's kind of binging session then, he can see beauty in the world. And he feels a sense, perhaps we'd say, of gladness or even a moment of happiness. And then he thought he might endure his exile yet another year or more. So at that particular moment then he thought, life isn't too bad. Maybe I can live like this. Maybe I can accept this. But think about it, of course, what's going to happen? Then he's going to start wanting to drink more and more and more. And he's going to end up doing exactly the same thing as he did the night before. He's going to end up binge drinking then to blot out or drown, of course, his sorrows, his anxiety, and his depression and loneliness. So if you think of the word exile, remember we had that, of course, when we were looking at King Lear, the notion, of course, that Cordelia was forced into exile or Kent was forced into exile. They were banished by Lear. So this is the idea, of course, that he feels obviously isolated, abandoned and alone. But when we actually think about it, the prodigal son did that to himself. It's a self-imposed exile. And that would relate back, we'd say, to Bishop and her alcoholism as well. It's kind of the notion, of course, that in a way, alcoholics choose to drink. Now, some would say, of course, that it's an illness or a kind of disease and alcoholics are helpless. But I think what she's trying to say, of course, is that, yes, it feels like that, but there is hope. You do have the opportunity to help yourself and sort of climb out of that difficulty. So in the second verse then, the next sonnet, she describes, but evenings the first star came to warn. Now, if you think of the star, it's a natural image, but it's also, of course, another biblical allusion as well. Because if you think about it, the star, of course, is associated with the birth of Christ. Think of the three wise men or the three magi, of course, coming then to bring gifts to the baby Jesus. So it emphasizes the idea of the star as a guiding light, showing you the way. So this notion, of course, of the star perhaps could guide her away from alcoholism. It becomes a symbol then, an escape route, a way out of the difficulties. And the star, of course, is supposed to represent eternity. You know, the idea they're burning in the night sky, of course, even though you can't see them, they're still there, they're constant. So it's supposed to represent the idea of something permanent then, that lasts. Also, if you kind of think about the idea of the star, of course, sailors use the North Star then to navigate the seas, to kind of guide them on their voyage or their journey. And this is the idea then of the star kind of guiding Bishop out of the darkness, out of the alcoholism, out of the depression. Starlight sometimes can be associated with romance or just simply the beauty of nature as well. So there are lots of different symbols associated with the star, and we can see how they relate back then to the prodigal son and how they relate then to Elizabeth Bishop, the poet, as well. So the first star came to warn. The farmer whom he worked for came at dark to shut the cows and horses in the barn. So this is the idea then, of course, that at the close of day, the farmer goes into the farmhouse. Before he does that, of course, he has to make sure that everything is safe and secure. Okay, so literally just closing the doors or locking the doors of the farmhouse, of course, obviously once he goes in, but outside the barn or the pigsty as well, making sure that everything is safe and secure there. So we have the image then of, obviously, the prodigal son being in the pigsty all alone, isolated from the farmhouse where all the other human beings are. And the idea of his loneliness and depression then overwhelming him, and obviously he turns to cheap drink then or alcohol to ease that sadness. So we have the image then of the farmer locking up for the night. beneath their overhanging clouds of hay. So it's the idea, of course, of feeding the cattle before he actually goes in for the night. And the overhanging clouds of hay, if you kind of think about it, obviously they're huge volumes, rounded volumes of hay. And usually, of course, they're tossed. Remember, we were doing that in the Robert Frost poem, talking about tossing the hay using the pitchfork. So he's just talking about, or describing here, or the poet is, of course, Elizabeth Bishop, is describing then the tools or the implements that are used. They're kind of hanging up in the barn. And the farmer comes in with his lantern and illuminates the barn then. So it looks quite beautiful when the farmer illuminates it using the lantern. And you get little flecks or sparks of light then, of course, when the fork, the pitchfork itself, or the other tools, the other implements that are used then on the farm are illuminated then by the lantern, the hand lamp, essentially then, that he carries around. So faint forked lightnings, catching light, safe and companionable as in the ark. So it's like the light then creates this lovely warm glow, essentially. And it's almost like that cheers the heart then of the prodigal who is in the pigsty. He feels kind of safe and secure when he sees that light, essentially. Remember, light is a very positive image and symbol in this particular poem. And if you think of safe and companionable, as if he's surrounded by friends, because it would be quite warm, of course, and he's very familiar with these particular animals at this particular point. And think of the ark, a biblical allusion or reference again to Noah's ark in the Bible, where they were all safe and secure from the storm, remember, from the flood. And it's the idea then of two animals, so the idea of kind of pairs, obviously emphasizing the idea of security and safety there again. So when the farmer comes to lock up, then he feels safe. He feels that just brief moment of contentment. The pigs stuck out their little feet and snored. If you think about it, we have yet another example of anthropomorphism here, where the animals are presented almost like human beings, essentially. They're almost like, we'd say, figures or characters in a children's story. If you think of the three little pigs, it's supposed to kind of remind you of that. So there's a sense, of course, of these particular creatures being quite sweet or quite cute then. But we'll see then in the last few lines of the poem how the prodigal son then begins to change his mind. So the lantern, remember the handheld lamp, okay, like the sun, there's the use of a simile there, like the sun going away. So now, of course, we have dusk or twilight. So we have a sunset then, where the sun slips beneath the horizon and everything becomes darker and more sinister then. So the lantern, because think about it, the farmer turns away. He has locked, of course, the barn door. The sty is secure. And then he returns to the farmhouse carrying his lamp. And as he carries the lamp, of course, it jogs up and down. It moves up and down at a very slow pace. So she describes it here, the lantern like the sun going away, laid on the mud, a pacing aureole. Aureole is like a halo effect. You know the way saints have them? It's like a religious image. Or a little halo effect that you get around the sun, of course, when you have a solar eclipse. You just get that thin circumference, essentially, like a shining light. So it's reinforcing the idea, of course, that the puddles, the mud, everything is illuminated just for a moment by the brilliance of the lamp or the lantern until the farmer moves away across the yard and into the farmhouse and just leaves darkness in his wake behind him. Carrying a bucket along a slimy board. Think of slimy as in greasy as such. It's supposed to emphasize how dirty, how filthy the interior of the pigsty is here. So carrying a bucket, so if you think of the bucket, of course, would that be a slop bucket? It's probably not a food bucket here. It'd be a slop bucket, so he could actually go to the toilet in the middle of the night. He's a bit like a prisoner, essentially slopping out in a very old-fashioned jail. So there's something disgusting about that particular image. It's very demeaning and very humiliating as such. So some people would say that the bucket just represents food for the pigs, maybe, or maybe food for himself as well. He's eating like a pig, essentially, here. But I think it does represent the notion of a slop bucket, where he'd need, of course, something to use as a very primitive toilet in the middle of the night. He felt the bat's uncertain, staggering flight. So think about it, a lot of people have a phobia about bats. They think, of course, they get caught in your hair. They think that bats are attacking you. I mean, bats, of course, are endangered now. And the whole point is that a bat will not attack a human being and usually will not bite or scrape a human being either. But they're usually kind of associated, of course, with kind of vampiric bats, and therefore the vampire image comes from that, kind of sucking the blood and so on. But that's just very, very rare. But it sort of emphasizes the idea, of course, that when it's dark, the bats are kind of flying around and he just feels very nervous or very agitated or terrified even. Because think about it, uncertain, staggering flight. The bats kind of look like they're going to whirl straight into your face until they usually turn course and then move further and further away here. The bat image is also a classical illusion. And the classical illusion, I have a reference to it here, relates back to three princesses who disobeyed the gods and then they were turned into bats. So the Miniades, essentially. And remember I was mentioning before about a phobia of bats. I think I've made a note of it here. Chiroptophobia, basically, is the fear of bats. So she may be just using that in terms of the fact that a lot of people would find them terrifying creatures, or it could be a classical allusion then, of course, to the three princesses who refused to obey the gods and worship Dionysus, and then they were turned into bats and had to spend the rest of eternity then, of course, as those creatures. His shuddering insights. Now, some people say kind of shuddering just means that he's sort of cringing, that he just feels disgusted by the stench, by the greasiness, the dirt, essentially, how squalid his surroundings are. But shuddering, of course, might suggest the idea then of the alcohol, maybe. And you know the way that if somebody who's an alcoholic doesn't actually drink, then they start shaking or quivering. The DTs, delirium tremens, and they have to have a drink then to steady their nerve. So it's the kind of body's reaction then to not drinking alcohol sometimes can be very, very painful and almost too much to bear as well. So think of the shuddering insight. If you have an insight, it means you have an understanding. So this is the epiphany then. He realizes something at the end of the poem. So the shuddering insights beyond his control, touching him. So the notion then, of course, that it's almost like this realization is breaking through in his mind. He has to come to terms with the reality of the situation and accept that things must change. But it took him a long time finally to make his mind up to go home. So this, of course, is Bishop herself talking about the stark reality of trying to overcome her problems and difficulties, of trying to have or find the strength to admit that she needs help. And the notion, of course, that she can't function on her own, and the notion that she's finding life just overwhelming. So it relates back to, of course, her mental illness in terms of anxiety and depression. And it also relates back then to, of course, she needs to investigate and find out why she's drinking. And obviously that would relate back to her childhood, because think about it, her father died when she was only 8 months old, and her mother was institutionalized then when she was only 6. And she lived with her maternal grandparents in Nova Scotia and then moved back to Massachusetts then to live with her paternal grandparents. So it's reinforcing the point then, of course, that she was always looking for a home, a sense of stability and security when she was in her 20s and 30s. And she didn't really find it until she moved to Brazil and found Lota then, the woman that she fell in love with and the woman that she lived with then for 16 years. So it took her a long time essentially to be able to have real relationships and to be able to feel any sense of happiness and security. So she was always looking for that sense of stability. She was looking for a home. And if you think about it, that relates back to the prodigal son then, who realized, of course, that he would have to go home and be humble, admit he was wrong, beg for his father's forgiveness, and hopefully his father would accept him. And that's exactly what happened then to the prodigal son. So we can see, of course, that Bishop hopes at the end of the poem that she will be able to make the right decision, that she will be able to find someone, that she will be able to forge that relationship and hopefully live a happy and fulfilling life. Okay, so if we would just go through the poem itself and just make sure that you're able to identify the basic aspects of style. I mean, there are lots more now that we could deal with. We could look at the sonnet form in some detail. We could look at some of the sound effects here. I think in terms of style, if you would focus on symbolism, the natural images, the biblical allusion or the biblical references, perhaps as well. You could look at the classical allusion towards the end then in terms of the bats. You could look even at the very specific adjectives that are used by the poet as well. You could look at the use of anthropomorphism, how the pigs are actually suggested or depicted here as kind of human beings. So you could focus on that particular notion and just see if that works.